One of the things that my team does that is a little bit more radical, when we have peer and upward feedback, we publish it to everyone so that we can show that candor is a huge part of our culture.
Welcome to the People Managing People podcast. We're on a mission to build a better world of work and to help you create happy, healthy, and productive workplaces. I'm your host, David Rice. My guest today is Valentina Gissin. She is the Chief People Officer at Garner Health. We're going to be talking about cultures of candor and how to build out behaviors into cultural competencies. So Valentina, welcome.
Hello, great to be here.
When we were talking before this, you mentioned you're speaking about institutionalizing culture at scale. I'm curious, what does that actually look like inside of a fast-moving healthcare startup? Like, what makes it stick?
It's not easy. I'll start with what it's not. It is not simply, writing down your values and putting them on the wall of your cool office and using them for shout outs in town halls every other week. It takes a lot more work than that. And you have to be deliberate, especially as you said, when you're growing quickly. And on top of that, you're largely remote, which is our situation. And so it really follows a couple of really important vectors. The first vector is everything the people team does, and really anything that touches everyone in the company. You have to have culture as a North Star and be very mindful that as you build, what you build further embodies the culture and doesn't dilute it. So that's avenue one. And then avenue two is culture's always perfect in the beginning, right? When it's like one founder with the 31st employees and everyone feels like a founder because there's this, it emanates from the founder and everyone just soaks it up and there's this apprenticeship model. Okay, so how do you scale that? And that's really avenue two, is figuring out, okay, how do we take that sort of leaders teaching leaders and really institutionalize and enforce that? So those are the two main things that we think about. And there are lots of different mechanisms for doing it. But like taking avenue one, for example, things the people team does, one of the things that my team does that is a little bit more radical and we can talk about later to institutionalize culture is when we have peer and upward feedback, we publish it to everyone so that we can show that candor is a huge part of our culture. That mechanism is more powerful in institutionalizing culture than me talking about candor for, hours and hours, perhaps, of class could be. And then on the apprenticeship side, we pour into our leaders, both from the top down and in a scalable way through manager training to ensure that they really are culture champions to their betterment and take every teaching opportunity to make others better.
Yeah, you mentioned there the publishing of 360s, and I think that's really cool. It seems like maybe a little bit of a radical move to reinforce candor. So I'm curious, what pushback, if any, have you seen from leadership or employees? And then how do you handle that?
So we definitely do get pushback. And the type of pushback that we get is, why would you do this? And so we have to kind of zoom people out and explain the goals. And I can do that in a minute. And then also, we get a lot of, I just joined, I wrote my 360s. Wait a minute, you're telling me that you're going to publish them? Hold on, open mine up. I need to go back and re-edit them all. I would say those are the two big kinds of pushback that we get. And I'll tell you kind of how we address both. So the whys are really, it is an incredibly powerful tool to normalize and teach feedback. And the way that it normalizes it, everybody is required to provide both constructive and positive feedback because we want people working on developing their strengths and guardrailing and maybe developing against their opportunities. And when you see, that everyone across the company gets this very thoughtful, constructive feedback at least once a year, that normalizes that everybody, including our very topmost leaders, get constructive feedback. And it teaches how to do feedback well, because we have some people in there who are really kind of, our best feedback givers are in there providing feedback. And then it also makes it very difficult in light of that environment to justify sitting on feedback for the rest of the year. Like, that's why it's such a powerful mechanism, right? That's why these mechanisms and these actions work better than words and teaching, is because like, okay, well, I'm going to have to deliver this feedback twice a year in reviews. How am I going to sit on it for the rest of the year? This person's going to know I had it, I
like that. It's sort of a real-time strategy. I think that's cool. You've built a system here also where you've translated culture into competencies essentially. And that is baked into things like performance reviews. Can you walk us through a little bit how you translate values, which I think can feel a little bit abstract to people at times, right? Into concrete competencies that they can apply?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, and for me, the development chain, the ideation chain is really like, what is your mission? Once you have that locked in, what are the values? And I really do think of values. I find that they are more useful for employees than anyone else. And so I typically write them with a lens towards how are they going to be useful for employees? So your values, your operating principles, however you've codified your culture, really should be written as the behaviors that will drive that particular mission, your particular mission forward in a way that is like relatively purpose built, although I'm starting to believe there are some universal cultural elements. And then from there, so now you're getting increasingly more concrete in terms of what does it take to achieve this mission. And from there, if your values are written well, they really should create at least a skeleton of a behavior code for employees to succeed at your company. And so, for example, one of our values is integrity. We never have two different stories in terms of what's going on at Garner. And so how do you take that and cascade something, kind of very high level as that? And we really think about like, okay, what behaviors exemplify that value on a day-to-day level, both from, when you start at the CEO level, it's maybe a little bit more clear, but what does that mean for like a line supervisor? Okay, well, and we really identified that and thinking through like from a behavioral perspective, how do we take this skeleton of behavior and really make a map at each level of what does success look like culturally?
I'm curious, how do you sort of identify when people think they're aligned with the culture, but then their behaviors suggest otherwise, right? Like, what do you do next?
Yeah, so these kinds of things come to us through a couple of different directions. One is managers will come to us and say, hey, we've hired someone who's not a culture fit. And what do I do? And the way that they identify it is typically the first inkling is like someone's not great at taking feedback, typically. That's sort of usually the first hint, either how high their standards are, how thoughtful they are in giving feedback. Those things tend to emerge later. How supportive and empathetic they are, that tends to emerge later, but somebody's ability to actually take thoughtful thematic feedback tends to come up relatively quickly. And those tend to be the first things we hear. And so whether that's the manager coming in or whether like literally we're getting pings saying, hey, this person is being aggressive or defensive in response to feedback. And typically what we do is we pull in the manager and we say, hey, it is your job to onboard your people to this company, including to the culture. And no, nobody comes in here perfect because our culture is unusual. And yes, we absolutely do a piece of the cultural onboarding as the people team, but we also provide broader onboarding guidance to managers, which says, you have an obligation to teach people how to succeed in Garner's culture. And here's some guidance as to how that we give them, when they start. And so it's really kind of getting the managers to be excellent at identifying and then helping onboard people who are going to be good in the culture, and then seeing the difference between people who really are mishires and who would be a rehabilitation effort to enjoy our culture. And what do we do then?
I imagine for managers who, maybe they were in something very different from this before, that's got to be a little bit of an adjustment period and sort of a learning curve.
It is, yes. And we support them. We have pretty rich manager training and that we require them to take as part of their onboarding, and then also provide them with close partnership along the way from my team.
Culture fit is like one of those things that's often tested in hiring, but you've taken a more of a don't ask, test approach, right? Like, what does that look like in practice? And like, what have you kind of learned from that as you've implemented that?
So I think the biggest thing, we haven't cracked this perfectly. I don't think that anybody has cracked interviewing 100%, although I think we're doing better than we were doing when we were doing behavioral-based interviewing. So on culture, the kind of test questions are really, we give sort of a layup that is the opposite of a layup, where basically it's very easy to give a surface level answer and very easy for the interviewer to then say that's a very surface level answer and provide actually deep feedback to the interviewee during the interview. And we do this, I don't want to give away the questions and that we use to do it, but basically like our interview involves creating the opportunity for the interviewer to give deep constructive feedback in the context of the interview in an empathetic, like nurturing way. I'm trying to help you succeed in this interview, but you like, this was an XYZ not great answer for these reasons, and I need you to dig deeper here and there. And so that's one big piece of it that we changed that really made it hard for people to show up and say like, oh, this feedback culture surprises me, because it was in the interview process. And we've had people opt out after that interview, which is a bit part of the goal, right? Like people don't want to be in a culture where you could be given feedback during an interview, then they probably don't want to be in our culture.
Yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's really interesting. I can imagine the reactions. This probably gets quite a few people off guard.
The reactions run the gamut. Yeah, I would say a lot of people really love it and are like, thank you. This is so refreshing and honest. And then there are people who are, we have really senior people, 25 years in the industry, and they're interviewing with our CEO's former chief of staff, who's very senior at Garner, but doesn't seem senior in the healthcare industry. And she's poking them and prodding them on their thinking and their feedback. And they're like, whoa, what's happening here?
I mean, I love it because too often you go through the job hunting process. Like when you're out there and you're looking and you go through interviews and people say, well, you got to go through a lot of interviews and kind of like, learn. But like, what are you learning? Most of the time you're learning, quite frankly, to BS your way through things. And I think that's really cool way to like give people something substantive to go, you know what, I actually did learn from that. And so,
yeah, exactly.
It brings more value to the interview for the person being interviewed. I like that.
I think so too. It's not quite as hard hitting as when I used to do. It's a different interview. Yeah, when I used to do culture interviews back in my Bridgewater days, afterwards people would say, like, what do I owe you for the therapy session? Or I never want to see these people again.
Oh, yeah. Now, when people come through the door, though, now they're aware of the culture because they've sort of faced that in the interview. But, it's like you said, it emphasizes feedback and candor, especially if they're coming in from more traditional environments. I imagine it still takes a little bit of time to adapt. So how do you kind of support them through that?
There's the stuff that my team does, and then we're working increasingly on making the managers more and more competent, like we talked about, at onboarding people into our culture. But one of the things that we do is we do deeper cultural training than I think many companies of our size, which is, you join day one, you get kind of your typical onboarding and high level overview into the culture. Then within the first 30 days, you get another window into our culture and how we use it to think about performance and our competencies and our culture competencies and, how our talent management process works. And you also get a culture case study session, which basically is 90 minutes facilitated by my team of real life scenarios that are cuspy enough that if you're coming from the outside, we want people to like, they're hard to be like, okay, how exactly does Garner culture work in this scenario? If you've been steeped in it for 2 years, you're going to be like, oh, this is obvious. This is, this principle or it's this cell in the culture competencies. But it's cuspy enough that our new hires have to really grapple with it, which I think is a much better way to learn a bespoke culture than, just somebody lecturing you about it or like, here's examples of what good looks like. No, we want examples of everything and you figure out what's good and bad. And so we do that. And we're currently working on a 2.0 of that would be closer to like 3 to 4 months in when you're more deeply steeped, where you both have harder case studies and where we solicit more deep feedback.
I'm curious because like, obviously that's really interesting. It seems kind of intense. So how are you measuring sort of the impact and the effectiveness of that on the new hire?
So one of the things that we do is we watch very closely, even being a non-traditional people team, I still quite like the old pulses. I like to ask directly. They may not be engagement based. They may be a little bit more performance skewed in some cases, but like they do work. from my perspective, when you really want to like find your way to an employee sentiment, even if it's not the direct question that you ask. And so we measure whether, overall, whether people are operating by our culture, both by asking people directly and then by asking people a few like cultural kind of not gotcha questions, but like, okay, are you operating by our culture? If you see others not operating by our culture, do you always give them feedback about it? And a few other related questions. And if people say like, yes, I think Garner operates by its culture and I'm operating by its culture, but no, I don't give people feedback when I don't see them operating by our culture. And no, I don't give people feedback when I see, below the bar work product at the level 3 levels above me and other things of that nature. We're like, oh, you don't understand it yet. Okay, there's more work for us to do.
We were talking before this, and you mentioned Bridgewater earlier, but you were telling me how, you brought elements of that company culture with you, but with key edits. And I thought that was an interesting way to say it. I'm curious, what parts did you leave behind and why?
Many parts, yeah. I mean, that was an incredible experience. And, for those for whom it worked, it really worked. And it worked for me. I'm not proud of everything that happened while I was there, but I learned a ton. I think you come out of that culture, if you're at all thoughtful and interested in culture, inevitably like a student of culture and kind of grappling with, to your point, what do I want to take and what do I want to leave? And for me, it's interesting because Bridgewater was profiled as in the Fearless organization as one of the most psychologically safe places to work because there is this incredibly open speech, truth to power environment. Yet for some people, it was incredibly psychologically unsafe to be there. And so that was really the nub for me of like, what, like, how do I reconcile this? And how do I suck out the good psychological safety pieces and the good things that made it so excellent and leave whatever it is that actually like counteracted this intention of raise? And for me, when I parsed it, it was really a few things. One, it was, yes, you could speak truth to power all day long, but sometimes power would give you feedback on your truth. Like you could give feedback in a meeting to the CIOs, but they could turn around and say, like, here's the 90 ways in which your logic is wrong with respect to the feedback you're giving me, and then give you feedback in the system, bad conceptual thinking and logic, and then you're an idiot in the system for all time. So one of the big things I took was like, the quality of the voice doesn't matter. You have to just reward the voice. And so that's one big piece. Another big thing that I think made it so fraught for people was that like, if someone saying like entering your Valentina down for logical thinking, and I will be an idiot in the system for all time, literally the goal was to assess people and to paint a picture of people over time, not necessarily to figure out which things they would be best to grow at. And really like, it was a little like Bridgewater overall was a developmental mindset, but the assessment approach was geared towards a fixed mindset. Like, let me understand how good of a conceptual thinker you are. That's not something you're going to improve on, but it's important to me that I get your conceptual ceiling right. So I know, what jobs to put you in and not. And so that idea of like fixed attributes and using them for assessment versus using constant feedback culture for development is a key difference.
Excellent. This has been a fantastic talk. Before we go, I want to give you a chance to, kind of give everybody an idea where they can connect with you, find out more about what you got going on. If you want to plug anything that you're doing, feel free.
Yeah, absolutely. So for all my people out there, you should definitely check out Garner. It could save you a ton of money on benefits and is one of the most incredible and fast growing benefits out there. And you can always find me on LinkedIn and see what I'm up to. And that's that.
The second thing that we do here on the podcast, or the last thing I should say that we do here on the podcast, we have a little tradition where you get to ask me a question. So I'll turn it over to you. You can ask me anything you want.
Yeah. What is your favorite interview question and why?
Oh, God. I always kind of laugh at those really abstract ones where it's just like, what space creature would you be? I'm like, oh, gosh. I actually just like the ones that are like, I like when someone has taken the time to understand the things I've done before. They'll just ask you like, how did you get X from this? And it allows you to really like dig into your strategic thinking, or because it's now a concrete example that we both have a context for. And so that like makes me feel very comfortable as an interviewee if the interviewer has done that. But yeah, I'd say that's kind of my favorite one, is where like we get into like the specifics, and you can, I'm a little bit of a rambler. If it's really focused, it keeps me from rambling. It keeps me on like these key points and makes me feel like, oh, like I feel good when I give that answer. You know what I mean? So yeah, it's those.
The ones where people can get into your thinking and not just,
but not about like space creatures, or, you know, how I would deal with being in an underwater submersible and the oxygen is running out. Like, I don't know. I don't want to know. You know? I never find out how I do in that scenario. Well, Valentina, it's been great. Thank you for coming on the show, and we'll definitely be in touch in the future.
Thank you. This has been great.
All right, listeners, if you haven't done so already, be sure to head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/subscribe, get signed up for the newsletter. And until next time, think about a culture of candor.